It's a great pleasure to introduce this lunch lecture of today. It will be the SPIER project at ZFL. And please allow me, as an old professor, and we are in the lecture hall, to start with a vocabulary exercise, not for you, for me. I think we need to define some of the acronyms we are using in the title, and this gives you some understanding of what we are doing. So I have to declare what is ZFL, which means Zentrum für Fernerkundung der Landoberfläche, Center for Remote Sensing of Land Surface. What is SPIER, the Space-Based Earth Observation Applications for Emergency Response and Disaster Risk Reduction. And UNSPIDER, United Nations Platform for Space-Based Information for Disaster Management and Emergency Response. And UNOOSA, which is United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. Let me start with the ZFL. ZFL is the Center for Remote Sensing of Land Surfaces, and it's University of Bonn's interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research center for Earth observation and spatial analysis. In collaboration with ZFL are researchers from many institutions, most of the University of Bonn, but not all of them. We have researchers from the Department of Geography, from the Institute of Crop Science and Resource Conservation, and the Center of Development Research. From the Forschungszentrum Jülich, we have one person, and we have one person from the Bonn International Center for Conversion, the Bonn Peace Research Institution. United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security is also collaborating within ZFL as the DLR, the German Aerospace Center, and a colleague from the University of Cologne, the Department of Geography. We are working closely together with UNSPIDER since 2016, and we have joint projects with UNSPIDER since then. The biggest of these projects is the SPIER project that started in 2019, has a runtime of 5 years, and it looks like it will be prolonged for 5 years more. SPIER is supported through the German Space Agency at DLR with the funding from the German Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action. Let me start with UNOOSA, which is the umbrella organization for our collaboration. UNOOSA stands for the UN Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. It was established in 1958 as the Secretariat of COPUS, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. 1958, this is 1 year after the Sputnik shock, so the first satellite that was launched into space was the Russian or the Soviet Sputnik satellite, and with that it became clear that the next step of humankind's expansion could be space, and the question was, what will happen to space if mankind is working there? Will this be a new frontier of colonialization and imperialism, or would it be something where mankind could collaborate? And there were very practical questions to be solved. One of them was, are we allowed to shoot down satellites that are flying over our own territory? If it would be an airplane, this would be not a question. But in outer space, this was a question. And as a mechanism or a governance structure for this, COPUS, the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, was established by UN in 1958, and the secretariat of this was the Office for Outer Space Affairs, with the idea to follow the same path as with the Antarctica agreement, so saying Antarctica, and with that, outer space, is not a territory for colonialism, for imperialism, it should not be settled without the consent of all, and it should not be used without the consent of all other nations. So the idea was, if we go to outer space, if we use resources of outer space, there must be a collaboration and there must be benefits for all nations, not only those who have the means to travel there. So the mandate of this committee aims at strengthening the international legal regime governing outer space. The mandate also specifies that the committee should support efforts to maximize the benefits of the use of space science and technology and their applicants. This was the main idea behind that. And one of the first ideas were that it might be helpful to support disaster management of any nation that is in need of that in case of a major disaster. So the idea was, it is only allowed to bring spaceships into or other objects into orbit and receive images from the Earth's surfaces if any country could benefit from that. So as in the time of the beginning of Earth observation, it was mostly espionage. This was a little bit complicated, and therefore the people came to the idea that disaster support could be a very good idea, and therefore they came up with a lot of agreements saying if someone is allowed to launch an object into space, he has to support the world community in case of major disasters. And this is still going on, and this was, I would say, the beginning of UNSPIDER. Even if a private company today launches satellites, they have to support nations in need in cases of major disasters. And with that, UNOOSA established in 2006 the United Nations Platform for Space-Based Information for Disaster Management and Emergency Response. It's a program of UNOOSA. The mandate is to enable developing countries to use all types of space-based information in all phases of disaster management cycle, including prevention, preparedness, early warning, response, and reconstruction. And it has offices in Vienna, in Beijing, and in Bonn. And we are collaborating with the Bonn office of UNSPIDER very closely. And with that, I'm coming to the outline of the lecture today. Martin Hillijegerdes will give an overview over the UNSPIDER program and the task of the Bonn Bureau. Adrian Strauch will give an overview over the SPEAR project and what we are doing there to support the UNSPIDER program. And Jonas Schreier will give examples of Earth observation applications for disaster management and disaster risk reduction in Africa. Our presenters are Martin Hillijegerdes. He is with UNOOSA, UNSPIDER, an Information Management and Media Officer. He holds a BSc in Geography from the University of Bonn and an MSc in Cartography from a joint master of TU Munich, TU Dresden, and TU Vienna, and the University of Twente. He was a cartographer at the Federal Office for Civil Protection and Disaster Assistance, and he is at the moment lent out to UNSPIDER. Adrian Strauch did a diploma in geography, also University of Bonn. He works with ZFL since 2015, and he is a project manager of SPEAR. And Jonas Schreier works with ZFL since 2017. He also holds a BSc in Geography from the University of Bonn and an MSc in Geography of the University of Bonn, and he is one of the pillars of the content-wise work with SPIDER. And with that, I give the floor to Martin. Please, Martin.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you for having me. It's great to be back here again. As Klaus already mentioned, I think it's been like 10 years now that I was a student here in this lecture hall, so it's great to be back here now on the other side of the lecture hall to give a short presentation about our work at UNSPIDER. I would like to show to you how technological solutions and mechanisms created by the space community can be used by disaster management agencies, and we are working on assisting those agencies on how they can use it. As we all know, especially if we study or studied geography, climate change and its consequences and other factors like demographic changes and settlements being built in risky areas are hitting communities worldwide, and with more heavy, more powerful, devastating extreme weather events, and you all know that. At the same time, there are also more technological solutions available that can be used to assist in those situations, but they need to be used by the right persons. They need to know about it, they need to know how to use it, and we are there trying to assist how that can be done. You have seen the mandate already in the presentation slides by Klaus Greve. We want to ensure that all countries have access to and develop the capacities to use all types of space-based information. We want to support the full disaster management cycle, which is why I have this little graphic here on the right side. I'm sure you have seen that before. And I want to point out that with satellite technologies, we can support all phases. That's why it's also in our mandate, because we know it can be used for all phases. Just some examples, if we look at the response phase right after a disaster occurred, we can do rapid mapping. We can map, for example, the extent of floods using satellite data. For recovery, the next step, we can use that. That's a UN term as well, or humanitarian aid term. We can use that for post-disaster needs assessment, for damage and loss assessments. If we look at mitigation and preparedness, we can use satellite information and data for early warning systems, first to set them up and later to use them. And we can also map or do hazard exposure, vulnerability, and risk assessments. Here, it says geoinformation, but it can also be translated to satellite information, because usually what we get if we analyze satellite information is geoinformation we can use further in next steps for analysis or for mapping. What's important to mention here, and I think it's something that's also mentioned in the lectures about this cycle, is that all those steps need to work together. We cannot only do one step and then that's good. We need to work on all steps at the same time, and they need to be linked. So we can perhaps design a system based on satellite data that already links all those different phases. UNSPIDER is connected or directly embedded in the UNOOSA program, UNOOSA office. It was defined in the mandate that UNSPIDER will be a part of UNOOSA, and we are reporting directly to UNOOSA, and we have another office besides the one in Beijing and Bonn in Vienna, which is directly linked to UNOOSA. There are other offices and sections working at UNOOSA. I just have on the graphic here. You can have a look at that also on the website of UNOOSA. So how do we try to fulfill our mandate? We basically divide our work in 4 pillars. You can sum it up like that. We have knowledge management, or specifically the knowledge portal, which is another name for our website, where we try to collect all sorts of information that link space-based information, or the space community in general, and disaster management. And we try to put it out in a way that it can be used by, for example, the users in disaster management agencies. And it might also be interesting for students or for researchers to work with that. We work on fostering cooperations. We see ourselves some sort of as a bridge builder between the space community and the disaster management community, but also between different, let's say, space community actors, because as we know, some might be a bit more technologically advanced already, and we try to bridge them as well. So we have contact to different space agencies and research institutions, and try to, for example, create content on our website that can be used by others. We have conferences and webinars and other meetings to connect these different actors. We also do capacity strengthening. Those are, for example, trainings, webinars, and we also provide training material on our website. And we do advisory support. Sorry. These are direct, let's say, missions in contact to the member states. So we would travel to a country, to a state, and contact the potential users there, for example, the space agencies, if they have one, or the disaster management agencies. And we invite different actors that might be involved in the disaster management cycle, and we talk and we do trainings and we try to connect everything. Summing up what we have done a little bit, last around 15 years, we delivered technical advisory services to around 55 states. I think now it's actually 57, if I'm not mistaken. We did 40 formal technical advisory missions. Formal means it's a specific kind of mission that's been requested by a member state to us, an official document, and then we travel there. It's usually the first mission we do. After that, we can have other missions and services we do for the countries. We also, just to mention that, it's important that it's on demand, so we need some official letter from, for example, a director of an agency to request that we do this support. We also sponsor, for example, data and help with getting data. We sponsor attendance at training workshops and at conferences. We also organize conferences ourselves, usually annually in Bonn. That was a bit stopped during Corona, of course. Sometimes we also help with emergency response directly. So we do some mapping in our office as well. But we are not, let's say, a mapping agency. We don't have the resources for that. So usually we try to connect the users to agencies that do that on a regular basis. We don't do that alone. We have a network of regional support offices. Those are usually either space agencies or research institutes. And one of those is the RSO in Germany, the ZFL, that supports us very much in our activities. They support us, if we look at the 4 pillars again, they support us in all of them. So they could, for example, provide content to our knowledge portal, to our website. They could cooperate in organizing conferences and meetings. They could also be part of those conferences and meetings, do presentations there. They could help us in providing trainings and webinars. And they could also, and sometimes do that, accompany us to missions, as for example ZFL did to Nigeria last year as well. Just to mention some content on our website, knowledge portal. There's a lot, also some, let's say, rather static information that, let's say, stays the same for a long time because it's informing about how disaster management works in general and space information works in general in that context. We also have dynamic content such as news about new developments, new applications that are available. We have information about events that are in that context of disaster management and space information. We also have, and I want to highlight that here, recommended practices, which are step-by-step guides from, let's say, starting with satellite information, with data from satellites, and getting to some sort of product in the end. Usually it's maps, but can also be just data that you create from it and can be used further in mapping, for example. We have plenty of those, and they are also usually supported or provided by RSOs. Just giving one example here, this is a recommended practice for flood mapping and damage assessment using Sentinel-1 data, Google Earth Engine. Google Earth Engine is a cloud-based platform that you can use, and you can create code directly there. You don't have to download data anymore, but you just run the workflow in there and get data out of it or result out of it. So you could have a look at that and at the other recommended practices as well. We are working on so-called practical use cases too. So right now we have these recommended practices, starting with satellite data, getting to a product. Practical use cases is something new. We still need to create some more. which is how can these products be used in the end. Some information about emergency response mechanism. As I've mentioned, we map sometimes, if it makes sense for us. Let's say we have the resources for it. We get requested by partners that we know already, and then we can do that. But we're not a mapping agency. We don't have resources for that. But there are certain mechanisms that can be used. They are set up by the space community. Just giving you 3 examples. International Charter Space and Major Disasters. You might know the Copernicus Emergency Management Service by the European and the Central Asia by the Asian space agencies. We also promote the usage of these mechanisms a lot. So we want our partners, especially the disaster management agencies, to use these mechanisms. Just to give you one example here, this is the International Charter Space and Major Disasters, which is a collaboration of international different space agencies. And what you need to use it, you need to have a so-called authorized user, which would request the activation of this charter. And we try to promote it to our partners, to the disaster management agencies, to the space agencies or similar agencies in the countries to be or become authorized users so they can actually activate it themselves. We as UNSPIDER can activate it on behalf of those agencies, but we really want them to be able to do it on their own. Because also, in the end, if it's activated by us, the maps will be provided, but the data might not actually reach the user in the end. In this process, there's also the term of project managers. There's the term of value-added providers. Project managers are really, as the term says, managing that activation. And you have value-added providers that create products in this context, and I think we'll have some more information on that later on. Because also ZFL provided some information as value-added provider. You can see an example here for the flood in Nigeria last year, but I leave it to Jonas and Adrian to get to more detail there. Just a quick example of some emergency response that we did ourselves. Using one of our recommended practices, we created a flood, well, let's say flood data, there's not really a map, but flood data for Malawi and send it to our colleagues there so they could use it for further steps in their management. I mentioned the missions that we do to our partners. Just to give you some examples for activities in Africa, because the SPEAR project is really supporting us specifically with activities in Africa. We did a mission to Ghana last May, meeting with the National Disaster Management Organization there in context of a workshop related to earthquake simulation. And we did a mission to Nigeria. We held a workshop simulating a flood event there, had several different agencies in Nigeria invited, and also heavy support by ZFL and that. And some things we plan to do next year, if the situation allows, of course. We always do virtual technical advisory support to our partners if it is necessary and if it helps them. We plan to do missions to Mozambique, South Africa, and Malawi, similar to the one we did to Nigeria. And we plan to mobilize African participants to events we organize in Bonn, such as trainings. For example, we have a training course together with DLR, ZFL, and colleagues from Copernicus in the end of February. And there's also the Flood Guide project, which is aiming to improve flood early warning systems using a system set up by Copernicus. It's a GLOFAST system. We have partners in Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, and Mozambique, and also ZFL is supporting in that context. And with that, I would like to end my part here, and I'm open for questions after the presentation, right?
Okay, thanks a lot, Martin, for this introduction to UNSPIDER. So I will now give an overview of the SPEAR project, which you already heard a bit about in the different parts today. So as Klaus Greve already mentioned, this is a quite long-term 5-year project that was initiated together with DLR, and you already heard it's based on funding from the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action. And basically, some of the ideas behind that project are that, first of all, it's a mechanism to support the the Bonn office of UNSPIDER that you just heard a lot about. At the same time, it's meant to bring specific resources to support African countries, to focus on Africa and supporting these countries with using space technology to improve their capacities for disaster management and disaster risk reduction. And it's at the same time also, of course, allowing us, the ZFL, as regional support office of UNSPIDER, to work closely and more concretely together, especially with the Bonn office of UNSPIDER. And yeah, so in summary, maybe the main objectives of SPEAR could be described as, first of all, to raise awareness or to support the awareness-raising activities of UNSPIDER about the usefulness of Earth observation for disaster risk reduction, disaster preparedness, disaster response and recovery, with a specific focus, as mentioned, on Africa and for African countries, to support a strengthening of institutional capacities in those countries on a national level. So, for example, also to strengthen collaboration between different institutions, like Martin mentioned for the Nigeria example, trying to bring like space agencies together with disaster management agencies and other relevant national agencies. And also, yeah, to ensure that space-based data, information, tools, and applications are accessible and available in ways that are useful and, yeah, more or less tailored to the needs of these different users in those countries and are easily usable and, yeah, accessible to them. And yeah, another point is also, of course, to facilitate international cooperation between the space community and these different communities that are relevant in the case of disaster management, disaster risk reduction, which was already mentioned quite a bit by Martin as well. And yeah, so regarding the regional focus, Africa, I mean, the idea is basically to strengthen the capacities of African countries to make use of these mentioned space technologies, because especially for those countries, it's sometimes difficult to really make use of new technologies. On the one hand, maybe with regards to technical restrictions, the amount of data you need to download, things like that, but also a lot of these available, especially freely available data sets are produced in Europe or in the United States and so on. So to just even make them aware about what's available, what can be used freely in Africa and how is a very important aspect of all these activities. And then, of course, to provide technical advice and institutional strengthening in that regard to support different institutions and different kinds of users in African countries to do this. And yeah, one way of doing that is, of course, to provide recommended practices and other guidelines that Martin also already mentioned, and yeah, make sure that they specifically address the needs and requirements of the African community. And yeah, one very important aspect of this is, of course, also to involve the African institutions, Africans in all of these activities, to allow them to participate in different events, and also to organize events specifically meant to support African institutions with those efforts. And that's all things we do within the SPEAR project. There are different work packages in the project. So one work package is about awareness raising and outreach, so directly building on a lot of these efforts of UNSPIDER you already heard about. Then another work package is about Earth observation, so methods, tools, applications, so really targeting on the more technical level and supporting UNSPIDER activities by looking into what methods are there, how can they be used by African users, how can they be made usable or accessible in easier and better ways, and how where are maybe gaps, where are new tools or new applications needed to improve the applicability of Earth observation for African countries and so on. And yeah, then there's the technical advisory support. That's also one of the main pillars of the work of UNSPIDER that you already heard about. And so within the framework of SPEAR, there is a specific focus on Africa, as mentioned. So this work package basically allows to do these specific missions to African countries and work with African countries, directly allow people from there to join these events here in Bonn that Martin mentioned, but also, yeah, mainly to organize missions there, to go there and support them. Knowledge management is an important aspect as well, because it's also a very important part of the UNSPIDER office here in Bonn. So there, the SPEAR project is also meant to directly support those efforts and that you already heard about. And strategy and partnerships work package is mainly meant to build on existing collaborations, expand them, and also find new ways of collaborating in that whole framework of SPEAR that was just described. Yeah, maybe just to mention, as you see at the bottom, so all of these activities within SPEAR are basically done jointly by ZFL and UNSPIDER, each with their own responsibilities, of course, and all is meant to really support the whole umbrella that UNSPIDER offers, with a specific focus on Africa. And with regards to the awareness raising and outreach, the SPEAR framework basically provided the resources for doing several events, different types of events throughout the 5-year period, which we are already closing or getting closer to the end, which is end of this year. And as you can see, this is kind of a timeline where you can see in blue bigger conferences, and these small also blue boxes are the missions that are usually done in African countries within the SPEAR framework. And then in yellow, there are expert meetings, which are supposed to take place in African countries or regional meetings. So the idea is to bring together several African countries from one region, like West Africa or South Africa. And then there are expert meetings in Bonn where people from African countries are mobilized to come here and join these events as well. And as you can guess, with regards to the timeline, the COVID-19 situation, of course, made a lot of changes in this regard necessary. So it was not possible, especially in the middle part of the project, to organize all of these events as planned. So that means we had also to be a bit flexible and move a lot of those planned activities to the virtual space, do virtual conferences, virtual expert meetings, and so on, which we did quite successfully, I think. Now things are getting more normalized again, and so that means that hopefully now towards the end of the project we can host a bigger final conference of the project as originally planned, and also have workshops, expert meetings here in Bonn that Martin already mentioned. And we are right now planning missions to mainly Southern African countries as well, as you heard. So yeah, that's about these activities. With regards to Earth observation and the different applications that we are doing there, I won't tell too much now because that's the part that Jonas will focus on after me and give some examples. But basically, the objectives of these work packages are to test, update, and develop, for example, recommended practices of UNSPIDER, other methods to see what's most useful, what's the most common and most easy to use methods as well for supporting countries with using Earth observation during disasters or in preparation of disasters, etc. Then, yeah, where necessary or possible, also to tailor those approaches to specific countries' need such needs might become aware or come out of missions to those countries, for example, or during the workshops and so on we are organizing. And just in general, this work package is also, of course, responsible for providing information and data to support the different UNSPIDER activities like missions and and other activities. With regards to technical advisory support, it's quite similar. I already mentioned, I mean, the SPEAR framework provides the resources to do missions specifically to African countries, like advisory missions or institutional strengthening missions, which usually are more focusing on capacity building training, so offering training on specific aspects of these activities. And what you see on the map is basically the original plan we had for countries, but as you already heard from Martin, there always needs to be a request from countries, so it's also a quite flexible framework, so not all of the countries that were marked here in the original project plan were the countries that missions really took place. Some of them, yes, then we also did missions in some other countries, and because of COVID, there was a period where no missions in the countries really could take place, but we did a lot of virtual missions, virtual training activities and so on to compensate for that. And so this is just an example of the original plan. But yeah, the idea behind this technical advisory support is really to provide capacity building and training, also some on-demand trainings that really countries request because of a specific need they have. And one important aspect is also that this allows to build more or less an African-wide network, or to build on the already existing networks of UNSPIDER and really connect to different stakeholders from African countries. Knowledge management, I also won't say too much because Martin already showed the UNSPIDER knowledge portal. SPIER is just meant to support that, to build on the existing knowledge portal and produce content for it, to, for example, guidelines for the use of new tools and methods. One idea we had with SPIER was also to look into the knowledge portal as such and how it could be advanced, enhanced in the future, and maybe design and implement more e-learning components for it. This is still ongoing. I mean, within SPIER, we didn't really have any direct funding to do that, but we just had the idea to use the opportunity to look into possibilities of advancing it. And that's basically also one point within the last work package we have, which is about strategy and partnerships. So there, one idea is also during the runtime of SPIER to look for sources for additional funding, to work on more concrete aspects, like, for example, this knowledge portal of UNSPIDER. But yeah, also other possibilities, so to work with the African community, try to mobilize funding that also allows to work with African countries directly in projects, and form other partnerships also here on the national level. One idea of SPIER is, of course, also to connect the German community within this thematic focus of supporting African countries for their disaster resilience and disaster management. So there we are also, for example, in discussions with other German institutions like the BBK or GIZ, who often participate in the events that are co-organized by us together with UNSPIDER. And so that's just an overview of the work packages we had. Now I want to give one example for a new project that we also acquired during the SPIER period, which is a smaller activity that was initiated by DLR. So the DLR is basically the project coordinator, and we as ZFL are a subcontractor in a project which is called the Sentinels for African DRR project. It's a small activity within the framework partnership agreement for Copernicus user uptake of the European Commission. And yeah, the main focus of this smaller activity is basically to look into the Copernicus program and everything it offers, and how to bring that to the African countries, to African users, make it easier available to them through capacity building, through development of guidelines and training materials, so that they can benefit from this vast amount of free and open data, services, and products that are available within Copernicus. And again, of course, with the specific focus on disaster management and disaster risk reduction. So, as I said, it's a smaller activity that started last year and will already end this summer. But we are at a stage where we produced first versions of different training materials, like a training module handbook, and we are in close contact with different test users for preparing a second version of that. We had training workshops and so on, and are planning to continue this until the summer, where our idea is to have a final version of such a handbook, which focuses on mainly floods and droughts, but also has some components on wildfires, for example, and general modules on how to use Copernicus, how to find data there, what is Copernicus in the beginning, and what's available there, and what's usable in Africa, and so on. So it has a rather broad focus, and this is all meant to also, of course, support the SPIER or UNSPIDER, because it's allowing us to focus a bit more on Copernicus directly and produce such training materials that hopefully are useful for the African community. And my last slide is just an outlook on our planned activities for this year. So we want to focus on the practical uses that Martin mentioned. So to really focus now on showcasing and explaining and developing scenarios to show how these different available mechanisms, data sets, and services can be used by different agencies in Africa based on concrete examples of disasters of different kinds, like floods, droughts, and so on. And yeah, by this we hope to being able to demonstrate a bit better how these different workflows can look like, how agencies can include those available services and so on in their own workflows, and how to benefit from it most. And yeah, besides that, we are planning to also publish scientific articles that summarize those activities in the form of case studies to support, of course, the organization and the thematic contents of the different planned UNSPIDER events that Martin already mentioned, and to contribute to UNSPIDER technical advisory support and missions that were also mentioned already. So that's basically what we have on the screen for this year. And as Klaus Greve already mentioned, there's ongoing discussions about the next 5-year period of SPIER, and it looks quite good that this will be successful. So that means that after this year, we will be able to still continue and prolong these activities for the next 5-year period. And yes, so with this, I will now hand over to Jonas to give some more concrete technical examples about the different Earth observation applications.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. Also, good afternoon from my side. I'm Jonas. And we're going to round this up with just some examples of what you can do with Earth observation and remote sensing in this disaster context. Some nice maps. First question, why would you use remote sensing for natural disasters? Well, remote sensing has a lot of benefits in general that also apply in this context. For example, remote sensing data covers large areas all at once. You can do great spatial analyses. You have data sets with great spatial resolution. And as remote sensing data is quite consistent and repeatable, it's very great to track dynamics of natural disasters. For example, in a drought context, this is very good. You can have scenes from every week, every month, every year, and compare them with one another, do analyses. And this is definitely one of the strengths of remote sensing. And nowadays, many data sets are free of charge. So any of you could download remote sensing data and start working on it. And there are many great free data sets. ESA's Copernicus program includes the Sentinel satellites, and they have high-resolution, state-of-the-art data. So I encourage you after this presentation maybe to check it out yourself. If we use remote sensing data in a natural disaster context, we usually look at 2 different kinds of satellites. I won't give you a rundown on basics on remote sensing, but in general, we have optical data, which you can imagine like taking a picture from space to Earth, just with a few more capabilities, like not only red, green, and blue, but also the capability to see infrared data, near-infrared, shortwave infrared. And there are multiple benefits to this. With this additional data, you can calculate indices, you can do all sorts of analyses, and optical data is great to visualize, but one caveat is that it's affected by cloud cover. If you take a picture from space and it's covered by clouds, well, you don't have any data. And that's where radar data comes in, which is not affected by cloud cover. It emits microwave waves that penetrate through the clouds. It is sensitive to water, so it has many applications in a flood context. However, it requires some more expertise to work with, may be hard to interpret, and it's not quite as versatile as optical data, but we'll show some examples of either one of them. Now the charter, everything has already been said. Just from our perspective, maybe some words. We supported multiple activations of the disaster charter, mostly in a flood context. And we worked as value-added providers in one of those activations, as well as project managers before. And I will now show you some examples of the maps we created in these activations. One of our recent activations was the floods in Nigeria. As Martin already mentioned, we had a workshop last year in Nigeria where we simulated a flood, which pretty much just happened as simulated a few days after. So we had really fortunate timing on that. A few days later, it would have been critical. But this way, our colleagues in Nigeria and ourselves, we were very well prepared. So the charter was activated in September, and we supported these efforts by creating maps as value-added providers. And I'll just show you some of those. For example, you can see here a map that is created using Sentinel-2 optical data, which is free of charge. It's part of the Copernicus program. This was quite early in the flood for this region, for this excerpt, and we were requested by our colleagues from NASTRA to check if there's any buildings already affected. We used an index, an optical index, normalized difference water index, NDWI, to identify flooded areas across the whole scene, and OpenStreetMap data for identifying buildings, and then overlaying our flood layer with the OpenStreetMap data. And what we realized is that OpenStreetMap data on buildings in Nigeria is not quite up to date. So if any of you is planning a mapathon, maybe Nigeria might be a nice area to cover. And looking at this map, these are provided in very high resolutions to our partners, so they can zoom in very far, and you can see some yellow spots here. These are affected buildings, and then some close-up maps that show some areas of interest. So this is what we provide in the charter context. Next up, one example where we applied radar data, Sentinel-1, also part of the Copernicus program. And for this one, we used a relatively novel approach, which is part of the disaster charter. They brought up an on-cloud processing platform, so you can immediately process the data right on their platform. And we used two scenes of Sentinel-1 radar data, one before the flood and one during the flood. And using this algorithm on the cloud, we could compare these two and identify the areas that were flooded. So this was also requested by our colleagues at NASTRA. We overlaid our flooding data with land cover data from ESA because our colleagues wanted to know, okay, how much crop areas flooded and which areas is the most affected cropland located in. So we prepared a table, sorted it by area of flooded cropland per district, and got great feedback. Apparently it helped them out a lot. This is also one application you can think of when using remote sensing in this disaster context. In summary, for this Nigeria activation, I also included one more map here. We were requested to check if any major roads were affected. Also one of these applications that really makes sense, especially for first responding. We used a lot of different algorithms and data, radar data, optical data. We used on-cloud services, but also state-of-the-art indices to identify flooded areas. And during all of this, it is quite important as a value-added provider to really stay in touch with the people in the country, right? In this case, our colleagues from NASTRA, so we can really tailor our maps to what they need in the moment. Next up, another flooding event. This one's 2 years ago in Sudan. I included this one because we also, of course, acted as value-added providers, but also as project managers in this one. And this shows you that also what was said before, you get an opportunity to work with data that you don't usually come across because it has to be provided in the case of a disaster context. So for this one, we used multiple scenes from the China-Brazil Earth Resources satellite. It's optical data, and we performed supervised classification, which means picking training points, sample points, and then classifying the whole image to flooded area and not flooded area. And we did this across multiple scenes for different time steps to monitor flood progression in this area in Sudan. And using this in an animation format, as you can see here, is quite useful for stakeholders. It's a nice visualization, and they can get a feel for which areas might be especially affected, how the flood progresses, which areas might be affected next, and so on and so forth. So in summary, from our side, working with these charter activations and our experiences, of course, first priority is providing on-time support. We work as quickly as we can, as soon as we get the data, to get the maps out to the people. And as I already mentioned, it's important to be in direct contact with the people who activated the charter, with the governmental institutions to really fill their demands, and tailoring the inputs on the fly to what they need. For us, it's also quite beneficial. We can work with data that we don't usually work with, so also some experience for us, and there are also opportunities for longer-lasting contacts to African partners. For example, after the Sudan charter activation, we had some more ongoing contact with the Sudan government, and that wasn't the case before, so also quite good to help each other out. Also help the charter people themselves, the people behind the charter. As we did the simulation in Nigeria, we tried their novel on-cloud processing services for the first time, provided feedback, and yeah, so it's a win-win situation. Now, a few words on drought. Drought, of course, is a bit of a different disaster. It's slow onset. You can't really delineate it as clearly as floods, but still, or especially in the case of droughts, remote sensing is a valuable tool. And not going through all the basics here, but there's a plethora of remote sensing indices that you can relate to drought. There are multiple types of drought, and you could get into a question, what is drought? But we're not going to do that today. What I can say is we usually focus on agricultural drought, so the point in time where drought affects cropland, and there are plenty of indices that relate to this. And here you can see an animation of some example data we did for the 2015-16 drought in South Africa. On the right side, you can see the drought year, and on the left side, a reference year where we had good conditions. And you can already see the red colors forming throughout December, January, which is early in the growing season for South Africa. So this drought really affected yields, and droughts in turn of this dimension can also affect food security. So remote sensing can be a very valuable tool to keep it monitored and to watch the progress and be prepared. Also, in this case, for stakeholders and decision makers, this data is very valuable. What you can also do with remote sensing, just real quick, phenometrics from space. You can identify growing seasons, when they start, when they end, and without going into too much detail, looking at the time, we can see the drought year in the bottom, where the start of the growing season was significantly shifted compared to a normal year. So this, of course, shortens the entire growing period, and this, in turn, shortens your yields, and so on and so forth. So drought and remote sensing, you can do a lot of stuff. Finally, another activity we did, the locust outbreak in 2020. I don't know how many of you heard of this, but it was the worst in decades in Eastern Africa and the Middle East. Again, not going into detail here, just going through it real quick. We used a set of parameters, Earth observation and remote sensing parameters, mostly leaning on the desert locust booklet here by the WMO and the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and use these parameters that are linked to locust habitability, as well as time series analysis and detection of vegetation decline to put out a machine learning algorithm. It's quite complicated. I can go through the whole methodology, or it would be another 20 minutes, but this is an example output. You can see some no data areas here. Unfortunately, it was quite a rainy year, which was also one of the causes why the locust outbreak was so big. Much vegetation, much food for the locust. But in general, you can see we were able to identify affected areas quite well, and some hotspots, and areas that were not so affected. And this was quite promising, and we're still working on maybe developing a recommended practice on this. And speaking of, finally, I want to encourage you, if you haven't worked with remote sensing data yet, but you're interested in a natural disaster context, or just in general, the UNSPIDER knowledge portal, as already mentioned, is a great resource, also for starters. You can go there, you can check out practices on droughts, on floods, maybe on fires if you're interested, and start working with data. It's free. So much data is free and open. You can just go ahead, create your own maps, and maybe you'll enjoy it. Who knows? And with that, I want to thank you also on behalf of my colleagues for your attention, and we're open for questions.